The park was quiet at noon, a rare kind of stillness that Elijah Walker always appreciated. A soft breeze stirred the trees above, scattering petals across the empty path. He found his usual bench beneath an old oak tree and unwrapped the sandwich he'd picked up from a corner deli. Turkey, avocado, no mayo, just the way he liked it. The satchel beside him, worn at the edges, leaned softly against his thigh. He took a bite and closed his eyes. Moments like these were rare. In his line of work, peace was fleeting, an illusion between briefings, surveillance, and the weight of secrets he carried for a living. But today was different. He was off-grid. No wires, no phone calls. Just him, the sound of birds chirping, and the distant hum of the city. Until he heard footsteps. They were deliberate, heavy, boots, not sneakers. Elijah didn't look up right away. He didn't have to. He'd been trained to recognize intent in the smallest movements. The pace, the posture, the air shifting. Something told him this wasn't just someone out for a jog. "Hey," came a voice. "You live around here?" Elijah looked up slowly. The man in front of him wore a badge, a scowl, and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the trees above rather than Elijah's eyes. Officer Brian Cutler. He had the kind of presence that announced itself too early and stayed too long. "I'm on my lunch break," Elijah replied calmly, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Everything all right, officer?" "You didn't answer my question," Cutler said, stepping closer. "I asked if you live around here." Elijah glanced at the badge, then the radio clipped to the officer's vest. "I'm sitting in a public park." Cutler's jaw tensed. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Loitering. Suspicious activity." Elijah arched an eyebrow. "Eating a sandwich is now suspicious?" "Don't get smart with me," Cutler snapped. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Elijah considered his options. His bureau ID was tucked inside his satchel. Flashing it now might defuse the situation, or it might escalate things, depending on how deep this officer's prejudice ran. But it was clear Cutler had already made up his mind about who Elijah was, and what he wasn't. He reached slowly for his bag. "Fine, I'll show you." Before he could unzip it, Cutler's hand shot out and grabbed his arm. "I said don't move." Elijah froze. "You asked for ID. I'm complying. I think you're stalling. Stand up." Elijah stood, slowly, eyes locked on the officer. "There's no need for this. Just take a second to." "I said turn around. Hands behind your back." The cuffs clicked too quickly, too harshly. Elijah didn't resist. He knew better. A crowd had started to gather. Phones were raised. Whispers echoed. People watching, unsure whether to step in or stay quiet. That was always the calculation. Speak up or stay safe. Cutler radioed something in. "Got a male, black, mid-30s. Possible suspect in the park incident." Elijah blinked. "Park incident?" He didn't argue. Not yet. He simply said, "You're making a mistake." "Oh, I doubt it," Cutler sneered. "We've had complaints. People like you hanging around." Elijah breathed deeply. "And what kind of person is that?" Cutler didn't answer. He just pushed Elijah forward. "We'll sort it out at the station." From behind, Elijah caught the look of a young woman filming. She looked terrified, but determined. "Don't stop recording," he said softly as he passed. Cutler shoved him again. Quiet. But Elijah didn't stop watching the trees, even as the cuffs bit into his wrists. Even as the freedom he'd always fought to protect was stolen, at least for the moment. He knew this wouldn't end the way Cutler expected. He wasn't the one in danger. The truth was, and it was about to surface. The ride to the station was quiet, almost too quiet. Elijah sat upright in the back of the patrol car, hands cuffed behind his back, gaze steady on the world beyond the window. Officer Cutler hadn't spoken since he'd shoved him into the vehicle, only muttering occasionally into his shoulder mic. The silence wasn't awkward, it was intentional, calculated, a display of control. The car pulled into the back lot of the precinct, and Cutler got out, opening the rear door with the flair of someone used to this routine. "Let's go." Elijah stepped out without resistance. His voice calm, his expression unreadable. "You're awfully quiet," Cutler muttered as he led him inside. "Most guys are either crying or yelling by now." "I've seen worse," Elijah replied, scanning the station with quick, subtle glances. Two plainclothes officers passed by. One looked him over, but kept walking. A clerk glanced up from her desk, paused, then looked again, confused. They reached the booking desk. A young officer named Daniels glanced up and froze slightly when he saw Elijah. "You bring him in?" Daniels asked, hesitant. Yeah. Loitering, suspicious behavior, Cutler said, slapping a clipboard down on the counter. Might be tied to that theft last week at the Northside Park. Daniels glanced at the cuffs, then at Elijah. You got a name? He asked. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Walker. Elijah Walker. The moment he said it, something shifted in Daniels' face. Just a flicker, but it was there. Recognition. Walker. He repeated, brows lifting. Do you have ID? Cutler laughed. He didn't show any. Kept stalling. Elijah's tone remained calm. I was reaching for it when I got cuffed. Daniels cleared his throat and reached for the satchel. Mind if I? Elijah nodded. Cutler frowned. Hey, shouldn't we process him first? Daniels ignored him, opening the satchel with careful hands. Inside, he found the familiar black leather ID wallet. He opened it and froze. Cutler leaned in. What is it? Daniels turned the wallet around slowly. The gold badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Cutler stepped back like he'd been burned. No, he's not. Elijah Walker, Daniels said, voice tight. Senior Field Agent. Clearance Level 4B. Active investigation status. Elijah looked directly at Cutler. Do I still match your description? Cutler's mouth opened, but no words came out. A door behind them opened. Two people stepped in. One was a sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit, the other a man in his 50s with a badge clipped to his belt. Elijah instantly recognized them. Special Agent Maria Chin and Assistant Director Reynolds. They must have seen the viral video. Elijah, Chin said, walking toward him. We came as soon as we saw it. I figured, Elijah said, turning slightly so she could see the cuffs. Daniels had already started unlocking them. What's going on here? Reynolds barked, eyes darting from Elijah to Cutler. Who made this arrest? Cutler shifted, sweat dotting his forehead. Sir, I thought he was ill. You thought, officer? Chin asked coolly. You arrested a federal agent in the middle of an open investigation. Do you understand the gravity of that mistake? Cutler stammered. There were complaints. People said. There were no complaints, Elijah cut in. Just assumptions. Based on my skin color, my presence, and your bias. Cutler's face drained of color. Reynolds turned to Daniels. Did he book him? No, sir. Just brought him in. Good, Reynolds said. Because you're about 2 seconds away from having to explain this on the evening news. Elijah rubbed his wrist where the cuffs had pinched his skin. I'm not interested in media attention. I am, Reynolds said grimly. This precinct has already been under scrutiny. This might be the last straw. Cutler looked helpless now. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Chin snapped. You didn't stop. You didn't listen. Daniels looked apologetic. Agent Walker. I'm sorry. I should have stepped in sooner. Elijah shook his head. You did more than most. He looked back at Cutler, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. This could have ended very differently, Elijah said. But I'm still here. And now I'm going to finish what I started. Chin glanced at him. The corruption case? Exactly, Elijah said, turning to her. And now I think we've just found another piece of the puzzle. He picked up his satchel, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the station without another word. Chin and Reynolds followed, leaving Cutler standing alone behind the desk, surrounded by silence. Outside, the sun was still shining. But for Elijah, the light had shifted. The truth was no longer just a weapon, it was a mission. And he wasn't going to stop now. The morning after the arrest, Elijah sat at his desk inside the regional FBI office, a tall building tucked between banks and courtrooms in the heart of the city. A cup of black coffee cooled beside a thick folder marked confidential, while sunlight streamed through the blinds, striping the case notes across his desk. He hadn't slept, not because of the arrest, but because of what it had exposed. The rot ran deeper than he'd thought. The investigation had started 6 months earlier, under a sealed directive, allegations of bribery, forged reports, and illegal surveillance tied to officers in the 17th precinct. What had once been whispers in the department had gained traction with anonymous tips and patterns too consistent to ignore. Elijah had requested to go in solo. No badge, no backup, just instinct and evidence. The arrest had been inconvenient, embarrassing, but also revealing. He flipped open the folder. Inside were timelines, transcripts, surveillance logs. He circled a familiar name, Officer Brian Cutler. Listed twice, flagged once. Internal Affairs had noted a pattern, frequent stops involving people of color, nearly all dismissed later, none ever fully documented. Yet Cutler had never been formally disciplined. Until now, he'd flown under the radar. Not anymore. A knock at the door pulled Elijah from his thoughts. Agent Maria Chin stepped in, holding her phone with a concerned look. "Elijah," she said, "you need to see this." She placed the phone in front of him. A social media post was going viral. It showed the video, Elijah being arrested, calm, composed, while Cutler barked commands. The caption read, "He wasn't a suspect. He was the FBI." The comments were on fire. Outrage. Shock. Support. Questions. Demands for accountability. "I didn't want this to go public," Elijah murmured, scrolling through the responses. "I know," Chin said, "but we're here now, and it's working in your favor. We've already received tips this morning from community members, people who've had run-ins with Cutler, and others." Elijah leaned back in his chair. "It's not just about one cop. It's a culture. It's tolerated and encouraged in subtle ways. But maybe now, people are ready to talk." Chin hesitated. "What do you want to do next?" He tapped the folder. "I want to go deeper. I need access to the internal rotation schedules. I want to know who Cutler works with most, who signs off on his reports, and which officers seem to not notice what he's doing." Chin nodded. "I'll pull the files." As she left, Elijah turned his attention back to the board on the wall behind him. A map of the city dotted with pins, red for locations of suspected incidents, blue for confirmed corruption links. He added a new red pin at the city park. Then he drew a line from that pin to Cutler's name. Later that day, Elijah stepped into a worn brown jacket, exchanged his bureau ID for a decoy badge from another agency, and walked a few blocks to a small cafe near the 17th precinct. It was a known spot where off-duty officers came to hang out, neutral ground, loud enough to talk freely, but private enough to lower their guard. He ordered a coffee and took a seat at the bar. Two men were at a table nearby, wearing jeans and plain t-shirts, but their conversation gave them away, talking about shift changes and ratting rookies. One of them mentioned Cutler by name. "He's lucky, man. Doesn't even get written up. Half the stuff he pulls? Anyone else would be toast." The other guy laughed. "Yeah, well, he knows who's watching his back. You want that kind of coverage, you gotta stop asking questions." Elijah listened, silent. He didn't need to confront them. Not yet. He just needed the pattern. After a few more minutes, the officers left. Elijah waited, sipping his coffee, then slid a small USB recorder from beneath his sleeve and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. Back at headquarters that evening, he compiled the audio with previous reports, building his case like a puzzle with invisible edges. Chin walked into his office once more. "Internal Affairs just greenlit your request. You've got access to every report tied to Cutler and his close contacts. 24 hours. Elijah stood, energized. "That's all I need." He didn't want revenge. He wanted truth. And now, he could feel it taking shape. Because in this city, justice didn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispered quiet and steady until someone finally chose to listen. And Elijah Walker was done being silent. Elijah's office was silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights and the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard. The room had become his war room, files stacked neatly, a whiteboard filled with connections and timelines, and a map with pins connecting incidents like veins on a city-wide body. Every thread pointed towards something deeper than isolated misconduct. It was a system. The deeper he dug into the 17th precinct's reports, the more obvious it became. Redacted complaints, suspiciously missing body cam footage, rewritten incident logs signed off by the same 3 supervisors, over and over again. One of them stood out, Lieutenant Gerard McKinney. McKinney had a clean record on the surface, full of commendations and glowing evaluations. But beneath that shiny veneer, Elijah noticed a troubling pattern: cases involving minority civilians dismissed without review, repeated oversight over officers with complaints, and financial inconsistencies in his asset reports. But what disturbed Elijah most wasn't just the paper trail. It was the silence. In every recorded interview or log, there was a gap, a hesitancy from those who worked around McKinney, as if they knew something but feared saying it out loud. That night, Elijah sat with Agent Maria Chin in a small, secure conference room. The screen before them displayed pages of internal data, wireframes of the officers involved, and audio logs from past interviews. "This is bigger than I expected," Chin admitted. "McKinney's name keeps coming up, but no one ever files a formal grievance. They just move precincts, or leave entirely." "Fear," Elijah said. "They're scared. And they've been taught that speaking up won't change anything." "But now we have something," she said, nodding toward the newest file. That call this morning from a retired officer. Said he's willing to talk. Elijah leaned forward. Set it up. I'll meet him tonight. Later that evening, Elijah pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the city's west side. The street was lined with modest homes and small porches filled with flower pots and wind chimes. The house he was looking for had a faded mailbox and a porch light that flickered gently. Retired Officer Dennis Harmon answered the door. He was in his late 60s, tall but bent slightly at the shoulders, with wary eyes and a guarded smile. Agent Walker, he asked. Elijah nodded. Thank you for agreeing to talk. Inside, the home was simple and well-kept. Family photos lined the mantel, weddings, graduations, birthdays. But in the corner, gathering dust, sat a shadow box with a police badge and folded flag. Harmon poured 2 cups of tea and sat opposite Elijah in the quiet living room. I left the force 10 years ago, he began, voice low. Couldn't stomach what was happening. But I didn't have proof. And no one wanted to listen. What was happening? Elijah asked. Harmon looked away, his jaw tightening. McKinney had a system. Certain officers, like Cutler, he'd shield them. Let them push boundaries. If they brought in results, he didn't care how they did it. And if they got too close to crossing a line, McKinney would make it disappear. Disappear how? Missing paperwork. Blamed civilians. Rewrote body cam footage logs to say the cameras malfunctioned. I watched it happen more than once. Elijah sat forward. Why now, Dennis? Why speak up? The older man's gaze softened. Because I saw your face on the news. And because my grandson was stopped last year, no reason. He didn't say much at first, but I knew the signs. Fear. Shame. I can't stay quiet anymore. Elijah placed a small recorder on the table. Do I have your permission to document this? Harmon nodded. Yes. I'll testify if it comes to that. The next hour was filled with names, dates, and locations. Harmon spoke carefully, remembering what he could, offering insight into the code of silence that held the precinct together. His voice shook at times, not from fear, but from regret. Before leaving, Elijah stood by the shadow box and looked at the badge inside. You tried, he said softly. I didn't do enough, Harmon replied. But maybe now I can. Back at headquarters, Elijah compiled the testimony into his report. With Harmon's account, patterns and Cutler's reports, and the newly acquired files from internal affairs, the case was no longer a suspicion. It was a truth waiting to be revealed. As dawn broke over the city skyline, Elijah stood by the window, sipping cold coffee and watching the light creep in. Below, the world carried on, people walking dogs, catching buses, heading to work. Most had no idea what had nearly stayed buried in the shadows of their community. But Elijah knew. And now he was ready to bring it all into the light. It had been just over a week since the incident at the park, but in Elijah Walker's life, it felt like a year had passed. The investigation had moved from theory to evidence, from whispers to names. Cutler was no longer the end of the line. He was the tip of a system designed to avoid accountability. And with retired Officer Harmon's statement on record, the cracks in the precinct's armor were finally showing. Still, Elijah knew the most difficult part was yet to come. He stood before a conference room full of internal affairs agents, including his supervisor, Special Agent Louise Harper. The tension in the room was palpable. On the screen behind him was a web of faces, dates, and arrows, each string leading back to Lieutenant Gerard McKinney. This isn't just about bad policing, Elijah said, voice calm but firm. It's about a system of reward and protection for officers who bend or break the law. I now have evidence of at least 6 falsified reports tied to Cutler alone, all approved by McKinney. Multiple missing body cam files. And a consistent pattern of targeting Black and Latino men without cause. The agents around the table took notes, some nodding slowly, others glancing at one another, uncertain. And you believe McKinney is orchestrating this? Harper asked. Elijah nodded. I don't just believe it. I can show it. I'm requesting a formal joint task force review of the 17th precinct immediate with oversight. And I'd like permission to interview McKinney himself. A long silence followed. Then Harper leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Do you realize what you're asking, Agent Walker? If you're right, this doesn't just shake up a precinct. This will go public. Political pressure, media storms, lawsuits. Are you ready for that? Elijah didn't hesitate. I didn't join the Bureau to look away when it's inconvenient. If we're going to demand justice from the world, we have to start by upholding it within our own system. Harper studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. You have 72 hours. Bring me something airtight. Later that day, Elijah arrived unannounced at the 17th precinct. He wore his full FBI credentials this time, the badge clipped clearly to his belt. Heads turned as he entered the building, some eyes narrowing, others dropping to avoid his gaze. He requested a meeting with McKinney under professional courtesy. The desk sergeant, clearly uncomfortable, made the call and directed him upstairs. Inside McKinney's office, the lieutenant stood behind a heavy desk, the blinds drawn, a single lamp casting a yellow glow over a stack of paperwork. "Agent Walker," McKinney said, forcing a polite tone. "Didn't expect to see you here. Still licking your wounds from that park misunderstanding?" Elijah didn't smile. "I'm not here about me. I'm here about Officer Cutler and your role in protecting him." McKinney's expression didn't change. "Those are serious accusations. They're supported by reports, altered logs, and now a sworn testimony from a former officer who worked under your command. This is your chance to cooperate, Lieutenant. Otherwise, everything I've found becomes public record." McKinney leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You think you're going to walk in here and tear this department apart with a few files and a grudge? You have no idea what you're messing with." "I think I'm walking in here with the truth," Elijah said coolly. "And if that makes people uncomfortable, maybe that says more about them than it does about me." The silence between them was electric. Finally, McKinney smirked. "Do what you have to do. But remember, the people who stir the pot are rarely the ones holding the spoon when it all boils over." Elijah rose. "That's fine. I'm not here to stir the pot. I'm here to clean it." By the next morning, news of the FBI's review had begun to spread. Quietly, but persistently. A few local reporters were already asking questions, and a couple of community leaders had reached out to offer support. Agent Chin entered Elijah's office with a small smile. "You've caused a storm." "Not my goal," Elijah replied. "But maybe it was necessary." She handed him a file. "We've got something else." A civilian named Marcus Tillman came forward. He was one of the men stopped by Cutler last year. The stop never appeared in official reports. He has audio recordings. Wants to speak with you directly. Elijah took the file, heart pounding slightly. Another puzzle piece. As the day wore on, he met with Marcus, collected the files, and reviewed the audio. It was exactly what he needed, proof of undocumented stops and abuse of authority. When he returned to the bureau that night, Harper was waiting in the hallway. "I've reviewed everything," she said. "We're moving forward. Full inquiry. You'll lead the task force." Elijah exhaled, a weight lifting, but another settling in its place. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "Let's get this done right." At home, Elijah sat on his apartment balcony overlooking the city. The streets below looked peaceful, distant from the battles he was fighting. He thought of the park, the moment of humiliation, the cuffs digging into his wrists, but also the moment he stood up and said, "Enough." Now, the world was starting to listen. Tomorrow, the truth would no longer be hidden, and he would be ready. The courtroom was quiet. Elijah Walker stood tall behind the witness podium, his crisp FBI suit immaculately pressed, the bureau seal gleaming under the soft lights. Months of interviews, files, transcripts, and testimony had led to this moment. On the other side of the room, Lieutenant Gerard McKinney sat stone-faced at the defense table, his once proud posture now subdued. What had started as a humiliating encounter in the park had grown into a full-blown federal investigation. And now, the truth was no longer whispered in shadows. It was being spoken out loud for all to hear. "Agent Walker," the attorney asked calmly, "can you summarize what your investigation revealed about misconduct in the 17th precinct?" Elijah nodded. His voice was steady, resolute. "We uncovered a systemic pattern of abuse that extended beyond individual officers. Falsified reports, suppressed complaints, targeted profiling of minorities, body camera footage either deleted or marked as malfunctioning. At the center of it all was a culture of silence, reinforced, protected, and, in many cases, encouraged by Lieutenant McKinney." There were murmurs in the courtroom. The judge motioned for quiet. "And were these practices sanctioned officially?" The attorney continued. "No," Elijah said firmly. "But they were tolerated. And when tolerance becomes routine, it becomes policy, unwritten, but just as dangerous." McKinney's lawyer rose to object, but the judge waved him off. "Let the agent finish." Elijah took a breath. "I didn't come here today to attack a department. I came to speak the truth. Not every officer is corrupt. Many are good people trying to serve their communities with integrity. But when those who wear the badge abuse that power, and those around them look the other way, justice is denied. Not just for the victims, but for every officer who tries to do things right." After the hearing, Elijah stepped outside the courthouse. A small group of local journalists had gathered, along with a few familiar faces, community leaders, former victims, and even Marcus Tillman, who had spoken out with his own story. Agent Maria Chen joined him on the steps. "You handled that like a pro," she said with a smile. "The department's internal board is launching their own review, and McKinney's facing suspension pending criminal charges." Elijah didn't smile, but there was peace in his eyes. "I didn't do it for headlines," he replied. "I know, but you made people listen." Suddenly, a voice rose from the crowd. "That's him, the agent from the park." Elijah turned. A teenage boy, maybe 16, had stepped forward. He looked uncertain, gripping a small notebook in one hand. "My mom told me what happened. She said you didn't let it break you." Elijah looked the boy in the eye. "I didn't," he said, "because it wasn't the end of my story." The boy hesitated, then asked quietly, "Can I be like you one day?" Elijah smiled now genuinely. "You can be better." That evening, Elijah walked through the same park where it had all started. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the trees. Families played. Runners passed by. It felt lighter somehow, as if the air had changed. At the bench where he'd once been arrested, he paused and sat down. He didn't need to relive the moment, he'd already transformed it. What had been meant to humiliate had instead ignited change. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his badge. Not as a symbol of pride, but as a promise. To protect, to challenge, to serve the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. In the months that followed, sweeping reforms were enacted in the 17th precinct. Body cam regulations were reinforced. Civilian oversight committees were established. Officers like Cutler were disciplined, and McKinney eventually resigned in disgrace before formal charges were announced. But Elijah never spoke about taking someone down. He spoke about raising the standard. And across the city, and eventually the country, people listened. Because one man stood his ground and chose to wear the badge of truth.